Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Regional Qualifiers Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. We've got two best of fives to cover here today, and their importance cannot be overstated. We already covered the finals, we covered the end of the domestic playoffs, and so we do know our first two teams going to Worlds from the LPL. Of course, it's going to be Billy Gaming as the champions and your number 1 seed, and then anyone's legend finishing second in terms of championship points qualifies as that second seed despite getting third in the playoffs. They are the two teams that are guaranteed to represent the LPL at the World Championships, but there are two other seeds up for grabs, kind of, one and a half if you really want to make that argument, which obviously we will talk about, but the 3 seed, which we will see a series over in today's video, and then the 4 seed, which will be fought over by the loser of the first series and the winner of the second series. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. Very curious to know what you thought of the series that we got, who you want to see going to Worlds from the LPL, whether or not you're excited by the outcomes, and how you think these teams are going to do based off of what we've seen most recently from them. So, all of that, leave all of it in the comments as you always do. But without further ado, let's get into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover. And at the end of the video, we'll be kind of previewing the final matchup. Only one best of 5 left to cover at the end of this video. As a bit of a plug and a reminder, first off, if you want more detailed analysis on, at the very least, the second series that ends up happening in this video, the 5 versus 6 matchup, I was on the analyst desk for LPL English, and I will be on the analyst desk basically as this video goes live, or at least a couple hours after this video goes live, for the final series of the year in the LPL, that final qualifying series. If you are interested in maybe seeing my thoughts live or just getting a more in-depth breakdown of how I feel on some of these games, go ahead and check out the links in the description to both the YouTube and the Twitch. Of course, come say hi in chat. I would always love to see you there, but it's definitely the best place to get a more, I guess, immediate breakdown rather than having to wait for some of these games, especially if you want my, just gut reactions. We were pretty on fire, I would say, last night on the desk in terms of the entertainment value, so I highly recommend you go check that out. Links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the content we're going to have today on the channel, and it kicks off with what I would argue is the bigger series here. The winner of this matchup between the 3 and the 4 seed ends up going to Worlds as the number 3 seed representing the LPL, and that means no play-ins required. The number 4 seed has to face T1 going into the World Championships. That is a nightmare scenario. This is a must-win series for both of these teams. It was a matchup between the number 3 seeded Top Esports and the number 4 seeded Invictus Gaming, and Top Esports is going to pick up the 3-1 series win. They are going to be the team that punches their ticket to the World Championships, and all I can really say is thank goodness that this happened, because I think that there are 3 consistently good teams in the LPL right now, and Top Esports was the one that I really wanted to make sure was in a good spot going to Worlds. I think it would have been really disingenuous to Top Esports if they got to the World Championships, had to play T1 in one best of 5 to qualify for the Swiss stage, and just couldn't get over it, because this team has more than earned their spot at the World Championships. As a reminder, this team got second in the summer split. They ended up losing in the finals to Billy Gaming in a very, very close series, very back and forth between those two teams. Same thing against BLG in the upper bracket finals when they went to 5 against them as well. They're really only in this tournament because they underperformed so heavily in the spring split playoffs, because they won winter as the champions to go to first stand, and obviously, there's a lot to talk about from their performance internationally there, but if they just get top 4 in the spring split, they're auto-qualified as the number 2 seed. It just didn't really end up working out that way. Luckily for Top Esports, they avoid disaster and get themselves in as the number 3 seed. For Invictus, their fall off is kind of becoming a bit of a concern for me. They really just were completely outplayed in this series. There was not a lot of back and forth competition, especially through the first 2 games. Really did feel like Top Esports was the better team in almost every single area and almost every single lane, and that is a problem for Invictus, a team that I think a lot of people were looking at as a potential, league-winning candidate, and a team that was maybe the hottest in the entire LPL going into playoffs, who has cooled off dramatically over the past couple of weeks. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Hong in the support position. I think this is up for debate. I think Kanavi was truly excellent in this series as well, but I feel like I talk about Kanavi so much and give him so much praise on this channel that, if I am going to break the tie for 2 people that I think both played really well, I'm going to break it in favor of the one that I want to talk about a bit more, and that's Hong in this series, who quite frankly just outplayed Mako. I know that there was a lot of conversation about who the first team All-Pro support was, because there wasn't really this gigantic breakout support performance from, the entire year. Mako, I think, was definitely the most consistent, but the upside just wasn't necessarily there, and I think the downside, still is possible for Mako. He was okay in this series, but Hong was so proactive. He was playing some of these fights so well. I think you're mostly giving this to him for his Renata in game number 4, where those ultimates absolutely obliterated IG's game plan. I mean, this draft in general from IG is questionable, and I'll talk about it. I don't think Lulu is unplayable in the mid lane. We've seen things like Morgana kind of rising in popularity for similar reasons. I think Morgana offers much more because of the wave clear and just the general stability. Black Shield is just crazy valuable, and even with Lulu as the mid laner, you can kind of sometimes run into a problem where you just don't have enough resources across the entire map to stop a lot of aggressive macro plays, which we did kind of see. But the biggest issue here is that you're relying a ton on the bullet time coming in from Misfortune to do damage in these late game team fights, and Hong's ultimate really just kind of neutralized a lot of that threat. And quite frankly, Hong's Renata in general neutralized a lot of the aggressive plays that IG wanted to go for, even not mentioning the ultimate, right? Like, he just played really well in that game number 4. I think he was also very good in the beginning of this series. I think generally top esports just kind of dominated the beginning of this series, and so, it's hard to point out Hong in particular as being the one to step up on things like Karma when everything was just kind of going right for top esports. But I think specifically he had the most impressive game of the entire series to me in game number 4, and I did just kind of want to give him a bit of credit because I do think Hong has been very good for top esports this year, so he is going to be my player of the series. Kanavi, of course, the other player that I think is going to be on everyone's mind for player of the series, mostly for those Pantheon and Wukong games in games 1 and 2, where he really was excellent at being able to open up the map when Rookie on the other side is picking things like Ryze and Galio, trying to be able to match alongside Poppy and Xin Zhao and these champions that want to skirmish and can create quite a bit early on in the game. Kanavi has to be on point, and he was exactly that, playing things like Pantheon and Wukong. Like I said earlier, you do need to skirmish and you do need to get gold and resources, and he was always just better in those fights than someone like Wei was on the other side, but specifically then the laners. I think he did a great job of capitalizing on the mistakes that the solo laners in particular were making. We'll talk about Rookie on the other side, who just had another bad series, and I am genuinely starting to get concerned that this is something mental that he's just not going to be able to overcome. But Kanavi, the kind of player that I think is being under-discussed in the LPL. I don't know how we got to the point where the MVP from the previous split is now kind of just fading into the background for top esports, but he, to me, is very clearly the best jungler in the LPL right now, and I think he has a ton of upside to actually do something at the World Championships because he wins in ways that are very difficult for even good opponents to be able to counter, because he's so effective in the early game at being able to establish pressure. If he plays his own game, it's genuinely just very difficult to beat that. We've seen that with players like Cuz at a lesser level on KT Rolster over in the LCK. I think Kanavi is just a better player than Cuz, a better version of him as a player. So excited to see if he can, potentially start to live up to that expectation globally. And then the rest of the team was good too. Jackie Love was awesome, especially on the Ezreal in game number 2. Loved his Kalista in game number 4. He's just a really good player, and I'm glad that, last dance, Jackie Love, if it is going to be the last time he ever plays pro, which by the way is not locked in or anything like that. It's certainly just a narrative that I think a lot of people have been running with because of what he's been saying on his streams. But if this is one of the last times we ever get to see Jackie Love, it certainly is exciting that we get to see him at the World Championships, especially after how good he's been throughout all of this year. 369 was excellent on the top side. There was one top laner that was definitely better than the other in this series at playing weak side, and it was not the Shy. His Rek'Sai was pretty good in game number 3, but outside of that, not much to talk about for the Shy. 369 just kind of beat him up on the top side of the map. And then even Cream, I thought, was doing really well in this series. All he really needed to do was stabilize in the mid lane against Rookie, and I think he did more than that. I think he actively was the better mid laner. So all the credit in the world to Top Esports. If they had lost this series, I would have genuinely been frustrated with them and with the system, because they more than deserve one of these top 3 spots going to Worlds. And then for Invictus on the other side, it is a bit, frustrating, I think, to look at where this team was at just a month or so ago and then see what they look like now, because this was not competitive. It's not like they looked like a team that was going down to one of the better ones in the LPL and just, couldn't quite get across the finish line. There are a lot of teams that I think you go up against Top Esports and you just don't pass the hands check, but IG should not be one of those teams. They absolutely should be more competitive in a series like this than they were, and I think it all really comes down to, can Rookie step up? And I hate to individually single out one player, but to me, it is so obvious watching these games that his priority is what they play off of. And when you give him things like Lulu in game number 4 to pair with Misfortune and Skarner as your jungle and AD carry combo, you're taking not only a lot out of Rookie's hands, but you're not really giving him a chance to actually play the game. And I understand why you might be a little bit concerned, because he wasn't very good in games 1 and 2 on the Ryze and on the Galio, these champions that do want to get out to pretty big leads. Kanavi was the best player in those games, and Rookie really couldn't do anything to stop him. He was down in gold in a lot of those instances, and Wei losing pressure wasn't great for that, but Rookie, I don't think was good there. And then he ends up playing terrible in game 4 on the Lulu. Like, I know it might be controversial to give him dud of the series, but I really do think that across this entire thing, he was the worst performing player. He was the one who underperformed the most, in my opinion. I think Wei and Gala had a couple of moments. Gala didn't even really get a chance to play any of these games. The only one he got a chance to operate in was the Ziggs game in game number 3. He still is the best AD carry Ziggs player here in the LPL. Him and Knight are the 2 best Ziggs players in the entire region. But, outside of that, like the Misfortune, the Sivir, the Zaya, like he never got to play any of these games because they were done. They were over by the time Gala got to get into it. Mako was really not able to engage and find anything here. Hong was much more active on the other side because they were constantly picking 2v2 winning bot lanes like Ezreal Karma and then Kalista Renata in game 4. And so Hong always was going to have more priority. The Shy was actively running it down, especially on the Camille and the Rumble in the early parts of the series, with the exception of game number 3. I think if the Shy was slightly worse in that 3rd game, he probably would have gotten done of the series, but it really just leaves Rookie, who I think at no point impressed me at all. Like, he was the one who I thought played the worst in these big moments, and this is something that's become quite regular for Rookie over the course of the past couple of years. I get it, and I understand this guy has had bad teams, and he's had bad teammates, and really he hasn't been on Worlds caliber rosters, but he needs to be the one to try and elevate these teams. It's been consistent, and I think the main one for me was that top esports roster from a couple of years ago, where Rookie was probably the biggest reason that team did not make the World Championships. He was genuinely bad when they were looking to make Worlds, and it can't happen again. This guy has been in the regional qualifiers over and over and over again. I believe this is his 5th or 6th time in the regional qualifiers, and he's never been able to make it out of them to get to the World Championships. He hasn't been to Worlds since 2019 on Invictus Gaming. It is now or never for Rookie. If he can't do it this year with this roster, with this much talent, like the amount of players that are on this team that have had success not only internationally but domestically recently, if he can't get to Worlds on this team at some point, we have to start saying that it is a Rookie problem. And then for top esports, I'm just happy for them. Again, I want to reiterate, this is massive for them, being able to go as that 3 seed. The 4 seed is basically a nightmare position because you have to play a play-in series against T1 to even make the tournament proper. It would have been a nightmare for top esports after this year and the way that they've performed, constantly being the number 1 seed, being in the finals twice, if they had not gotten a chance to actually play in the Swiss stage. But luckily, they end up bailing themselves out here with the championship points fiasco. They end up getting themselves that number 3 seed, and I think they're going to make some noise at the tournament. I think this team is better than people think they are right now, and I'm excited to see if they can prove that. And that's going to bring us to our 2nd series, and this one is just as big of a deal as the series we just covered, if not even more so, because at least for Invictus, they get the chance to play one more best of 5 to get themselves to Worlds. The loser of this series is done. Not only is their quest for Worlds over and finished, but they get an invite to ASI, which they may or may not take in terms of playing at that tournament. This could be the final series we see from the loser of this series. The winner, of course, stays alive to meet Invictus Gaming. It was a matchup between the number 5 seeded JD Gaming and the number 6 seeded Weibo Gaming. And JDG are going to pick up the 3-1 series win here. They are going to look really good, I think, for most of this series. Things got pretty sloppy in game number 2 and in game number 4. There were definitely some moments that felt like JDG was kind of throwing things away. Game number 3 was just kind of bad overall for, JDG in terms of the way they executed. They allowed the Smolder to get out of control, and I think specifically allowing Poppy on, blue side, essentially in second rotation is completely unacceptable, but at the end of the day, they had enough firepower to be able to overcome Weibo Gaming and stop the yearly Weibo miracle run here in the regional qualifiers, get some revenge for 2024 and for Ruler, with Pays coming out on top this time. For Weibo on the other side, it's obviously got to be frustrating that your year ends here, or at the very least, your quest for Worlds ends here, but we can't really be all that surprised with how this team has played for a majority of this year. As much as we can talk about the Weibo magic, it's not really ever felt like they're that same kind of team that they've been in the past, where they have that, we can beat anyone on any given day type of mentality. It just hasn't really felt like that is the version of Weibo that we've gotten in 2025 in comparison to 2023 and 2024. This team has felt much more subdued. Yes, we had that big best of victory over anyone's legend in the playoffs, but basically everybody was beating AL. At that time, it took kind of a reality check for that team to start getting back into gear and for Tarzan to start playing well again. Ever since then, it hasn't really felt like Weibo's actually been competitive enough to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the other teams that are competing at this level. We saw that against JDG when these two teams last played, and we saw it even more in this matchup. And unfortunately, that means it is going to be the end of their quest to try to get to Worlds. But let's talk about this series in general. Shun, for me, is the obvious choice for player of the series. Not only was he the player of the game on the broadcast for all 3 games, but he certainly earned it for, at the very least 1.5. It's kind of hard to, say whether or not Shun or Pei should get it for game number 1. I think both of them were excellent. Game number 2, certainly a choice. I probably would have given it to Xiaoshu on the top side on this Renekton in terms of player of the game. I think he was the most relevant player on that side in that game. But game number 4, there is no debate. Shun was the best player on the Rift. He was landing every single smite, which ended up really pushing JDG over the top and honestly just avoiding disaster in a couple of scenarios with, things kind of progressing poorly for the Pantheon Twisted Fate Lucian team. And then, obviously that massive team fight around Baron where he basically just like 1v5s at certain points. Scout does a lot of damage. Xiaoshu, I think, does a good amount as well. Zhuo's ult is late, but it's definitely there on the Taric, and we can at least talk about that. But Shun really was the guy on the Pantheon in terms of the late game damage at the end of that. So credit to Shun. This is probably the best of 5 he has played all year long. And what a time for that to happen. Truly, what a moment for him to step up and get his team 1 series away from Worlds. He has a really, fun story, I think, to track, depending on what happens the rest of this year. If this guy can get back to the World Championships, remember, he was in World Finals last year. He was in Game 5 of the World Finals last year, and now he's sitting here hoping to get in for a chance to play against T1. We'll talk about the matchup against Invictus a little bit later, but Wei versus Shun certainly is a very fun matchup to preview and talk about, and he has set himself up for a really good standing in that matchup. Not everything was perfect. I think game 3 had a couple of problems on the Neferi, and again, Trundle I don't think was like a perfect game from him in game number 2, but he made up for it in game number 4 with the Pantheon, with the steals, with the fights. He was the best player on the Rift here today, and I don't think there's a lot of argument against that. I think Pays is the other player that you really want to shout out, just being very good across most of this series. The only reason he wasn't really in conversation for player of the series for me is because he kind of did the opposite of Shun, where he was excellent on the Yunara and then was really good on the Sivir, even stepped up on the Zeri, just didn't really have the peel to be able to make things work in that 3rd game, but he was sprinting it on the Lucian. He had a terrible game number 4, really ended up underperforming that, and almost kind of put JDG in a really bad spot, losing that game 4 with the reverse sweep on the horizon. Things could have gotten really scary if he had played slightly better in game 4. Maybe he was player of the series, but because he didn't, wasn't really in the conversation for me. Xiaoshu, I think, was very good across most of this series. Again, the Cassante had his problems in game number 1, but ended up becoming unkillable in that game. The Jax had some fantastic dives, ended the series with a really great pick onto the main carries of Weibo Gaming on the other side, and the Renekton was my player of the game for game number 2. I think Scout and Zhuo, Scout was fine. Scout was actually getting pretty big leads individually in the 1v1, which I think was really important for this team, and getting out on the map and opening things up with things like Twisted Fate did, for the most part, work out, mostly because Shun was playing aggressive, but doesn't really feel like this team plays around a lot of those macro mid laners as well as a lot of the other teams. But Zhuo was not good in this series. If you want a negative, he was really in the running for dud of the series for me in terms of how this was breaking down. He tried to sell this team's chances of being able to pick up a victory as much as humanly possible. Unfortunately for him, the rest of this team was playing too well to lose this series, even on Taric in game 4, which should just run a lot of this game. He was allowing free engages and ulting way too late. He was ulting defensively, which means you have like a 1 or a 2 second buffer where that ult is not going to be applicable in the most important part of a team fight. It was not ideal. He had a horrible game on the Nautilus, a horrible game on the Alistar. Just not a good series overall for Zhuo, but if he's one player that you're worried about, like that might be enough here in the LPL to get your team to Worlds, especially if Shun and Pays as the big dynamic duo end up playing the way they did in this series. And then for Weibo on the other side, there are a couple of players that I think you can praise, but for the most part, it was a very up and down series for everybody. Light's KDA ends up looking really good. That's mostly because he was donated a ton of gold on the Kai'Sa and the Smolder in games 2 and 3. When you're talking about the most important moments, his positioning really let his team down. On the Kai'Sa in game 2, he was the most fed member of the team, and there are 2 points in that game where he is so far forward that he ends up losing fights for Weibo, and it really comes back to bite them. He was useless on the Corki, ends up missing almost every single skill shot in that game, and the Misfortune, while it was effective, wasn't effective enough, and he was walking up and auto-attacking instead of pressing Q in a majority of these fights, and it was really, really frustrating me. Light had the worst year of his career. I'm very happy to say that at this point now that domestic season is over for Weibo Gaming. It's the worst he's ever played, I think, as a starter in the LPL, and it's a really terrible time for that to happen. But with all of the controversy and talk that's been going on about how he doesn't really get along with a lot of the bot lane partners he's played with over the course of this year, it just has kind of been an exhausting year for Light, and unfortunately for him, it is now over. I think if you're looking for positives, I think Xiaohu and Breathe were fine. I think they were okay enough. Xiaohu was getting kind of trounced in the 1v1 in lane. He was pretty consistently down in resources, even in okay matchups, but in team fights, he was actually really effective. Multiple moments where I think he opened up the game both on the Azir and on the Akali in game number 4. They just really weren't able to capitalize and actually make things worthwhile there. Breathe was huge on the Aatrox in game 2 and was almost the savior in game number 4 on the Gangplank, a pick that I think is, starting to grow on me a bit. I've not exactly been the biggest fan of that champion, but I think he was okay in this game, and I think he ended up kind of looking really solid into a comp that doesn't necessarily scale all that well into the late game, but he gets caught really importantly on the top side during a fight around, I believe, the 3rd or the 4th dragon, and that basically loses Weibo the game. Now, there were a couple of other things that do kind of compound off of that, but you can't really be dying on Gangplank in the late game first in a team fight, or else your team's going to be in a really bad spot. Unfortunately, dead of the series had to go to someone. I'm giving it to Crisp. I considered TN because I think he was worse in game 4. Crisp actually had some phenomenal engages on the Rel, but he was really bad throughout the rest of the series. The Leona and especially the Nico were just terrible, and that's why I'm giving it to Crisp. TN was actually pretty good. I would say for most of the series, his Poppy was incredibly good in game number 3, easily the best player on the Rift in that game. And while the Zed was a bad pick, it wasn't necessarily bad execution from him. He didn't really make any major mistakes. I think Crisp was worse across the series as a whole, even if I did consider TM, because he couldn't really land a smite in game number 4, and that's probably what ends up costing them this 4th game. But again, Crisp, I think just execution-wise was pretty terrible. That Nico game, man, I do not want to see him on that champion again. It just looked so bad, and you would think that he would actually be really good on this champion. He's been so good on Rakan throughout his career, which he was good on in this series, but, that other playmaker that's really popular in the meta, it certainly does not feel comfortable for Crisp to operate, unfortunately, was a pretty big problem, and now Weibo, having never been able to find a consistent support across all of this year, is dragged down out of Worlds by the fact that they couldn't really find a good support performance when it mattered the most. It is what it is for Weibo. No miracle run this year to try to get themselves to Worlds, but now for JDG, they are 1 series away from being that 4th seed and from a date with Destiny against T1. Multiple members of this team have some really, really fun storylines for that series, in particular Shun going up against Wei to get back against Owner in the play-in stage, the player that beat him in World Finals last year. You have Scout, who's a former T1 mid laner, going up against, his former mentor in Faker, from forever ago, and obviously it's always fun to see those two go head-to-head. You have Pays, who was kind of the chosen one in the LCK, and he was consistently able to beat Gumayushi and consistently able to beat T1 when he was playing there domestically for Gen G. Players like Xiaoshu and Zhuo have never been to Worlds, and they are huge underdogs. They were on Group Nirvana teams at the beginning of this year, and now they are 1 series away from going to the World Championships. There is so much to talk about for JDG, but they still have to get through Invictus Gaming, which is certainly easier said than done. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Regional Finals Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. Only one more series remains here in the LPL, but before we get into that, let's go ahead and take a look at the teams that have qualified for Worlds. Now that we have 3 of them confirmed, we of course have Billy Gaming and Anyone's Legend having qualified through the playoffs, as you can see, but Top Esports securing their spot as that number 3 seed with their win over Invictus Gaming. I cannot stress how important it was for Top Esports to win that series. The difference between the number 3 and number 4 seeds at this tournament is larger than it will ever be in the history of League, unless they continue to run this format back, because you have that play-in series. And so Top Esports being able to get that 3rd spot after the year they've had, and how successful they've been, the number 1 seed in both spring and summer in the regular season, 2 finals appearances, 1 trophy, the fact that they are actually able to confirm a Swiss stage spot at the World Championships, I think, is obviously fantastic for them. But who's going to follow it up with that 4th seed? Well, that's where we get to the preview here. You can see the bracket. Only 1 series remains. The number 4 seeded Invictus taking on the number 5 seeded JD Gaming. The winner of this goes to Worlds and goes to Worlds play-ins to take on T1 for that final Worlds Swiss stage spot. This might just be who we want to throw to the Wolves to go up against T1, but like I said, there are a lot of interesting storylines for both of these teams going up against T1. You have players like Shun and Scout and Pays that have a ton of inbuilt storylines, and even, Xiaoshu and Zhuo, who obviously obviously were not expected to go to Worlds and never really probably had the anticipation to go to Worlds this year that have a chance to make their first international appearances. But for Invictus, this is about overcoming the monkey on your back. This is about Rookie getting back to Worlds for the first time since 2019. This is about someone like Wei going up against the player and Shun that he got benched for at Worlds last year. He was chosen over Shun and then replaced midway through the year by Billy Gaming. Can those two, can one come out and kind of prove that they're better than the other? That is an amazing storyline that I'm very interested to see. You have someone like Gala, who has not been able to find the success this year that he's looking for. Mako, who's been consistently successful at this level. The Shy, who basically came out of retirement to come back for this team. Like, there are so many pieces. All of these players want to make the World Championships. Both of these teams at the beginning of the year expected themselves to be at Worlds. Only one can do it. Who do I think it will be? Honestly, I have no idea. Like, genuinely, this is the most lost I think I've been in terms of a prediction, and the most even I think it's been throughout the entirety of the LPL playoffs. I'm not pretending like I've gotten everything right, but I've certainly been quite successful in predictions over the course of this LPL playoff run. I have no clue here. I am going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to take JDG 3-2. I think that they're kind of on fire right now. I think Scout's going to be fine in this series, and I think Shun's got a bone to pick going up against Wei, the player that Billy let him go for, essentially, and I think Pays is just really good. I think Pays right now is better than Gala, even if he hasn't showcased it across this entire split, and I think that's enough to get JDG to Worlds. But if you want to tell me that the Shy just completely dumpsters Xiaoshu on the top side and that Zhuo is just not good enough in this series to go toe-to-toe with Mako, I would understand that as well. I truly believe that there are a lot of ways to look at this, but for one reason or another, I'm going to kind of take the team that's definitely a bit more of an underdog here, and I'm going to go JDG 3-2. We'll see if that comes to fruition, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering this series in a game-by-game breakdown since it's the final series of the LPL year, and like I said before, I am going to be on the LPL English analyst desk for this series, so check out the links in the description. That, series is basically going live in like an hour or two after this video is posted anyways, so definitely come check that out. We're also, of course, covering the LTA championships, the LEC playoffs, the LCK playoffs on this channel as they go throughout that, and then, of course, Worlds as it comes around. So hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all